care. And I think that's why psychedelics are having this kind of cultural moment right now. Is we're in this, you know, whether you're talking about anxiety, depression, suicidality, substance abuse, these are all rates that are going up. Like we recognize we're not doing a sufficient job of treating mental health.
Okay. Payton Nyquvest, welcome to the Gents Talk Pod.
Thanks for having me.
How are you? You flew in recently.
I did.
On Air Canada.
On Air Canada.
And you're going to check us out on Air Canada.
I'm going to 100% check us out on Air Canada.
Yeah, because your episode will be up there too.
I'm looking forward to it.
And you can tell everybody that you're
I'm going to be, every time I hear somebody that's on a flight, I'm going to be like, are you flying Air Canada?
Yeah.
If so, I know what you got to do.
Episode, yeah. Well, listen, thanks for coming by. We appreciate you being here. You have a fascinating story. But I don't want to be the one to tell it. I want you to tell us your story. So let's just start straight with you. You're a CEO of a company called Numinus. And it's a company that specializes in treatments and therapy. But there's an element of the use of psychedelics in that process.
Correct.
Now, there's a general misnomer around psychedelics. A lot of people associate them as like a hard drug that's really bad for you. Stay away from it. Lock your doors. Protect your children type of thing. But you're here to sort of shine some light on maybe some things that are misunderstood about psychedelics and how that works and how that can be used to help treat sort of therapy in patients.
Yeah.
So let's start with, you know, who you are, how you got to this point, and we'll jump right into it.
Yeah. You know, kind of starting for me, so I'm someone who, I was born with severe chronic pain and, you know, has been something as I was kind of growing up and as a young kid that really grappled with, I mean, at a very young age, because you're always looking at your own mortality, this real grappling of like, am I supposed to be here? And as a young person, that's like a very challenging thing to kind of meet. And, but I grew up in a family household that struggled with substance abuse, and my mom got sober when I was 12 and came home from rehab. She was gone for about 6 months and came home and gives me a hug. And the first thing she says is, you might want to start talking to somebody. And I took that really, really seriously because of my chronic pain. And, you know, you watch somebody and it's, you know, it's your mom. It's the person that, you know, as a 12-year-old you love more than anything else in the world. And, you know, I watched my mom go through that adversity and see herself the way that I always hoped that she could see herself. And it was this really like, okay, like there's maybe some hope for me in this as well. And so at 12 years old, become very, very passionate about mental health and and in particular, like this intersection of mental health and physical health. You know, I was aware at a very young age that my upbringing was maybe not the healthiest upbringing. And then, you know, when you have a parent that is an addict that goes into sobriety, you see the real, like, you start to see like, oh, some of the things that were happening to me are not necessarily the healthiest things that should be happening to a child, right? Yeah. And so the sort of volition behind that was this chronic pain that I was suffering with. And so as a young person became very passionate about mental health and started to become something of like a mental health advocate in my community. And it wasn't intentional. I had a couple friends that, you know, felt like they could benefit from some of the things that I was doing. And I just didn't want to be the only kid in therapy. So I was hoping that more of my friends were gonna join in. And that kind of led me on this sort of like healing crusade that I had been on. And then in kind of early, you know, getting out of high school, my chronic pain is continuing to persist, but I'm seeing the benefit of all the mental health work that I'm doing. So it's keeping me, it's kind of like enough breadcrumbs to keep me going on the path. And then at 18, I wasn't smart enough to become a doctor, but I knew I wanted to help people. So I naively get into the finance industry thinking like, well, I'm not smart enough to be a doctor. maybe if I make people more money, that will help them with their happiness or provide them with a better life. Really quickly realized how naive that idea was. But I really loved the part of that industry that I really loved was I got to experience so many different industries. I got to work with people, and I got to really, you get this kind of interesting vantage point, especially the kind of work that I was doing. You get this very interesting vantage point of how organizations operate and what makes one successful and what makes one not successful. That all to say, kind of fast forward to 30 years old, I'd been a part of a couple brokerage firms. I'd bought in a smaller brokerage firm with a group. We'd sold that to one of the largest independent brokerage firms in Canada. At 30, I was running the West Coast offices for that firm. I was a director of the Across Canada firm. I was sitting on the advisory board for the TSX, and I was seeing all this success. But my chronic pain had never been worse. And I was ending up in the emergency room like 3 days a week. And I remember actually the most like financially successful week of my life, I spent that whole week in the hospital. And I remember sitting there going like, if this is like what success is supposed to be, then you can have it. Not like all I want to do is just be healthy. But I was also slipping into this like mindset of maybe this is like the burden that I have to bear in order to be successful, and it was this very interesting kind of dynamic I was getting in, but eventually got myself to a point where I was really out of options. And at that point in time, my chronic pain, essentially like it was severe gut pain that within 30 minutes would be, the best way I can explain is just the absolute overwhelming experience of pain. And that like well that the pain felt like it was coming from felt like infinite. Right. And so it was this race to get to the emergency room or commit suicide. Oof. And it was this very binary, like I say that and it sounds severe, but it was just this very binary, like, can I get somewhere where the pain is going to stop, or am I going to have to just like take this into my own hands? Yeah. Right.
It's a scary place to be.
It's a scary place to be. But it was interesting, like also how many times I'd faced that. It almost took the charge out of it. And I maybe didn't appreciate how heavy that was probably weighing on the people who really loved and cared about me. But all to say, where I kind of ended up was I felt very out of options. I tried everything. Private health clinic, like I could probably, with all the testing and stuff I've done, I probably could fly to Mars. But
you're NASA ready.
I'm NASA ready. But really was out of options. Yeah. And there was one day in the emergency room, I said to my partner, now my wife, I said, you got to trust me, but I got to do something quite different. And she said, what do you want to do? And I'd researched psychedelics for like a year and a half. I'm kind of a down the rabbit hole kind of person. I'd never had a psychedelic experience in my life because I grew up in a family that struggled with substance abuse. I was always kind of the anti-recreational drug person. Right. But I said, I got to try something. And the plan was to go to Costa Rica and go do ayahuasca. Yes. And, I said, this is what I got to do. And she kind of looked at me and she said, so let me get this straight. You have severe chronic gut pain and your game plan is to fly to the jungle and drink this like tea that makes you throw up, and you think that that's going to alleviate your gut pain. And I was just like, that's the best I got. Yeah. And I booked my flights while I was in the hospital. I went home, packed my bags, got on the plane, flew to Costa Rica. And
the whole time you were on that plane, like, is there a point where you're just like, what am I doing?
The deal was that I'd made with myself is it was like, either it's this or I'm done. And I was so not defeated, but I was really like, there's this interesting kind of intersection of like hope and faith and surrender. Right. And I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. Like I think that's where you really find like, and faith is a loaded word, but you in those moments of really not despair, but actually like really truly letting go, that was kind of, I think, the place where I was at. And so, you know, get to Costa Rica, and you know, it was interesting going through that whole experience. I had no, you know, you watch the YouTube videos, you listen to a couple of podcasts, you have these kind of expectations of what it's going to be like. My experience was like none of those things. And as I'm going through the experience, because my experience wasn't like, you know, what the YouTube videos had said, I start to go into this like, it's not working, right? And there was an experience that I went through that I kind of credit to really being like the catalyzing experience, where I had to come to full acceptance that maybe what I've been experiencing is actually just what I'm supposed, like, what if there's actually nothing to fix?
Okay.
What if this is actually just the experience that I'm supposed to have? And what if that was it? And really like coming to terms with that, and not coming to terms of that in the sense of like, yeah, I come to terms with that, but like maybe in the back of my mind, like it'll get fixed. Like actually like hands and knees acceptance that like, if this is all that I was ever supposed to experience, like coming to like a gratitude and compassion for that. And I go through that experience and come out of that experience, and I knew right away that it was gone. And not to paint the picture of a panacea, but at the end of that week, I never had any chronic pain symptoms ever again.
How long ago was this?
So that would have been 2018.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what is that, 5 years?
5 years, yeah.
Okay, so maybe backtrack a second here. For those who don't know what ayahuasca is,
Yeah.
what is it?
Yeah, so ayahuasca is the mixture of the ayahuasca vine, and then there's a number of plants that contain dimethyltryptamine, DMT. Chacruna leaf is typically the leaf that's used in ayahuasca. And so it's the combination of those two plant materials brewed into a tea that are used in typically a group ceremony. And it's about a 6 to 8 hour experience that takes you through, you know, I think when I say the word psychedelic, people go like, oh, tie-dye and visions and all that kind of stuff.
Truthfully, that's what I think, because that's my only exposure to what those are.
100%. And certainly there can be an aspect to that, but it's a very, very small portion of what that is. And, you know, we now have a lot of good scientific data around the default mode network and the potential for psychedelics to essentially give you an experience of calming down the default mode network. And our default mode network is essentially where we hold our programming for our relationship to experiences. Okay. And the best way that it's been explained to me, Michael Pollan talks about this in his book, How to Change Your Mind. If you think about like a snowy hill, and you take a toboggan down a snowy hill like over and over and over again, you get these grooves in the snow, right? And no matter where you take your toboggan on the hill, you end up falling back into this groove in the snow after a long period of time. What psychedelics do is help groom the snow.
Okay. And
give you this opportunity not to forget the experiences that have happened to you, but how can you potentially create a new experience, a new relationship with those experiences. And that's something they call neuroplasticity, which is giving the brain a malleable state to be able to actually create new neural pathways within the brain. So ayahuasca is a psychedelic. There's many others, and DMT is actually the psychoactive compound within ayahuasca. And that's been traditionally held in ceremonies coming out of Peru for thousands and thousands of years. We've got now very good evidence of how long those have been used. And typically they were used in smaller communities in, a kind of regularly cadenced ceremony that the community would come together to do healing work and support one another and also solve problems within the community. Mm-hmm. And so that's like the condensed, the Coles Notes version of ayahuasca.
Well, you went down to Costa Rica.
I went to Costa Rica. I was supposed to do ayahuasca, but we didn't get in touch with a shaman. But I was actually wondering, because I was told that the ayahuasca, attacks the mother wound.
So
sorry, what's the mother wound?
any kind of like, I mean, it could mean many, many different things, but essentially like if there's any trauma associated with the mother or feminine side of your relationship to your parents, right?
Okay.
Ayahuasca is typically called, like they call it like grandmother, like it's called the grandmother. People will argue or say that it sort of has like a feminine sort of spirit maybe to it. You know, grandmas can be pretty tough. So yeah, but it definitely, you know, is referred to with that quality for sure.
Yeah, which I found interesting, because I wonder if that played into, because you talked about your mother a lot and she was enacted, if maybe confronting that mother wound maybe helped with
100%. 100%. I mean, there was another experience that all to say, and I'm touching on the pyrotechnic or the psychedelic parts of this, but a lot of my experience, there was no visions attached to it. It was just this physically challenging sort of experience I went through. But I actually went through an experience of essentially re-experiencing my birth. And and I don't say that in the sense of like a visual or like a dream, like it was me literally feeling like I had experienced that process again. And I had a very challenging birth experience. My mom went into cardiac arrest while she was pregnant with me. I had to be removed from her and put in an incubator for 3 days, and it was this challenging, we almost lost my mom. It was this challenging sort of process, and I'd known that for a very, very long time. But what's interesting, and we see this a lot with psychedelic work, is in particular if you have trauma pre 5 years old, so your kind of ego gets formed around the age of 5, right? And you start to like be able to have this objective ability to look at yourself, right? And so, but if you have trauma pre-5, your nervous system is firing and wiring, you know, from the day you're born, if not before, right? Your first connection is with your mom when you're in the womb. So if you have traumatic events that have happened to you before the age of 5, your nervous system is holding that event, right? If you're in a deep fearful state or a pain state or something like that before the age of 5 years old, your body's experiencing that imprinting that you have is holding and experiencing that. And it can be really hard to heal and release that trauma as an adult, because we don't, you know, you think about like talk therapy. Talk therapy is like you've got these memories, you've got this understanding of your relationship to those memories, but somatically you can really be in a challenging space to actually alleviate that from your nervous system. And I think that was a lot of what I was suffering with, was trauma before the age of 5, and it was kind of this double-edged sword of like starting my personal work as young as I was I was almost building up this like mental capacity of understanding what was challenging for me without the tools or the resources to really bridge it. And so the pressure that I was kind of putting up against it continued to mount and be more significant as well. So while it was helpful, I think in a lot of ways it was also making it very, very challenging for me as well.
Okay, so in that 6 to 8 hour, I'm going to go back to the ayahuasca just for a second. In that 6 to 8 hour window where you're going through this experience, what exactly is happening to you physically, mentally, you name it? Yeah, I mean,
everybody's experience is different, but it's a combination of like physical challenge, mental challenge, experiences of like complete bliss and release, and you know, I would say like a real deep-seated compassion, and really building that ability to be compassionate and feel like worthy of that compassion, right? And you know, you can throw up in the bucket. You can
bring an extra pair of underwear.
Bring an extra pair of underwear for sure.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Pack double. Pack double. All the above things can happen. But But it's interesting also, like, to be in that group experience.
You're doing it with other people.
You're doing it with other people.
Okay.
Over a few amount of days, right? Or is it just
so
one
we
day?
actually did 4 ceremonies in a row, so 4 nights in a row, and everybody was there for about a week. But
so you drink this tea 4 times.
You drink, 4 times or 4 nights. And there's, for me, there was a group of people there, and there's a real like camaraderie to going through something like that together too, right? Like anybody who's played like team sports or something like that, when you go through, like, there's a collective experience that you can go through. And as you watch people, and in particular when you're in that retreat setting or just any sort of like community setting, when you hear people share little aspects of like what they went through, there's this real recognition of like, oh, like here's a part of like how that shows up in my own journey, or like there's a real collective healing process that happens. And I think it's something that's really, really missing in our current, especially in mental health care, is there's this real absence of like community support and group work, right? And there's a lot of like, you're on the couch with the therapist and you're going through the story, and there can be this real heaviness of like, I don't know if other, and you're hearing one person's, kind of paid perspective of like, don't worry, everybody goes through that. And you're kind of like,
I paid you to say that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's why we're seeing, you're starting to see like whether it's men's groups or like different things that are starting to pop up. And I think that that's really important, right? So that we can have this like reflection of when things are hard. There are actually people who are going through similar things, right? And there are people who've gotten through it, and there's people who haven't gotten through it, right? And we need that community, and we need that kind of collective support, because ultimately, like, why are we doing all of these things? So that we can have better relationships with ourselves, and we can have better relationships with other people. And healing doesn't happen in a vacuum, right?
Yeah. So talk me through Numinus, how that sort of comes about, and sort of the work that you're doing now.
Yeah. So, I go through that experience, and honestly, like for me, one of the more scary places that I ended up. So I go through this retreat, I come back home, and I'm now Payton without chronic pain. Whereas my whole life I've been Payton with chronic pain. I know myself as Payton with chronic pain. My family knows me as Payton with chronic pain. People in my community, my friends, they all know me as Payton who has this thing. And it's this really kind of scary, like, how do I relate with myself now? Even like timeline wise, I was like, man, I was going to the hospital 3 days a week before, like, I got all this time to like do new stuff, right? And it was this really kind of scary moment of like, how do there was a fragility. I knew that the pain was gone, but there was this, I hate to, like, the word sacredness has some like muddiness to it, but like there was this like a newborn kind of mentality, or this feeling that I had of like, how do I cultivate and build some structure around this thing? Because it felt like there could be the potential for me to slip back into the old pattern again, right?
Is there a fear?
For sure.
Like you'll wake up one day and the pain's back?
Not anymore. Not anymore. I mean, honestly, like, and honestly, going back then, there wasn't either. Like, there was a real gnosis of like, that's gone. And the kind of like takeaway was that it was gone as long as I was willing to allow it to be gone. Like, I get the best explanation was like, the system that was holding that pain was still there, but the fuel that I was putting in it was completely different now.
And I'm sure you've seen doctors since.
Yeah.
What's been their reactions?
It's funny. Like, I had this one.
They'll never prescribe going to Costa Rica.
Well, and this was, so I had one doctor who I'd worked with for quite a while, and he was at this private health clinic, and, kind of a high regarded person. And so I come back and I sit down with him. I'm like, I don't have to see you anymore. He's like, what did you do? And I'm like, oh, well, went and did this. And I start like getting on a little bit of a roll, like people who've just done ayahuasca. It's kind of like the CrossFit thing. Once people do psychedelics, they don't shut up about doing psychedelics. So I come back from this ayahuasca thing, and I'm sitting with this doctor, and I'm going on, and he's kind of like, he's like nodding, and he's kind of got like this open, and I'm like, he knows what I'm talking about. Maybe he's done ayahuasca before. And so I'm getting on this role of talking to him, and he's like looking like he's writing down some notes and stuff like that. And I'm like, okay, like I found some community here. Like what I'm not crazy. Like this is a thing. Yeah. Anyway, so he gets up after I talk for a little while. He gets up and he goes out to the washroom or something like that, and his notepad is still sitting on the desk. And I look at the notepad and it says, "What is ayahuasca?" And it was spelled like IZW, and I'm like, oh no, like I'm in trouble now. Yeah. But I would say that the thing that I like as I was coming back was I felt so fortunate that I've been able to have this experience, and I felt so grateful that I was able to have this experience, and I felt compelled to somehow give back to this experience that I'd had. And I feel like I credit a lot of that to like me being able to create community. Was, you know, I had this like real draw to giving back, and that really forced me to like reach out and start to talk to people. And you know, within a very, very short period of time, you know, at the time there was really no like corporate or industry interest in psychedelics. It was primarily not-for-profit and academic groups that were doing research. And so I start reaching out, and in like 3 weeks, I'm talking to Health Canada and like the heads of MAPS, which is the largest research organization in the space. And the thing I kept hearing back was there's nobody building any kind of infrastructure to be able to actually take this research and move it into application and a model of accessibility, right? And that was really, you know, kind of the impetus for starting Numinus, was like, how do we continue to support research, but how do we actually make sure that there's a place to land here for people? And for me, like the commitment for me around that was, I was fortunate enough to be able to get on a plane and fly to Costa Rica and pay to go to retreat. And I'd had all of this, you know, mental health work that I had done. And I had all this kind of like resourcing around this experience. That's not most people's experience or opportunity.
What does it typically cost to do ayahuasca?
So I think it was probably like $5,000, $6,000. Okay. You know,
it's a lot of money.
It was a lot of money to a lot of people, yeah. and in particular, people who are really suffering. Sure. Right? The people who like go to do these kinds of things, like it's not like, oh, I'm feeling a little bit off, maybe I'll go do some ayahuasca, right? Yeah. Like most of these people are people who are really suffering, and most of them have been let down by a number of different treatments that didn't work. And that for me was like, you know, you asked like, how did it feel when I was flying down to Costa Rica for the first time? And it was kind of like, you know, I'd thrown everything out, like there was nothing to lose, because right. felt like I'd been let down so many times, right? And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck, is there's this hopelessness of like, I've tried things and nothing's worked, right? Yeah. And in particular around mental health, right? Like we don't have a lot of very good options for where we go for mental health care, right? You end up on an SSRI or an antidepressant, and if that doesn't work, you have some event that happens to you, and where do you go? The emergency room, right? And we think of the emergency, like if the emergency room is the last line of defense, right? If the emergency room doesn't work, then like,
what else you got?
What else you got, right? And that, you know, now, especially up in Canada, I think the third most active reason why people end up in the emergency room is complications with their mental health medication.
Wow,
you know?
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's huge.
It's huge, and it's not.
It sounds so preventable.
Well, and I think that's what's really, really shifting around mental health care, and I think that's why psychedelics are having this kind of cultural moment right now. Is we're in this, you know, whether you're talking about anxiety, depression, suicidality, substance abuse, these are all rates that are going up. Like we recognize we're not doing a sufficient job of treating mental health,
and exacerbated by the pandemic.
Correct. And so with that, if you look at all of these different things we use, right, whether it's antidepressants, SSRIs, and they have their place, but that's symptom management, right? And a lot of times we think like, oh, if I'm labeled like or diagnosed a depressed person, then that's it. I'm a depressed person for the rest of my life, and this is a thing that I have to treat. Right. What psychedelics are showing is maybe there's curative intent here, and maybe we can actually cure some of these mental health indications that people have. And that can sound like a big statement, but if you look at, so I mentioned MAPS earlier. So for anybody who doesn't know, MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Science, and they've existed for 37 years and have raised $150 million all through philanthropy to take MDMA through clinical trials for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. They've just completed their second phase 3 clinical trial. They anticipate MDMA being legal for therapy this time next year. But the results from their phase 3, and they were treating people with treatment-resistant PTSD, which means you've had to have tried at least 3 other major interventions and not have them work. It was primarily veterans. So of that population, over 80% of people saw a significant clinical reduction in their symptoms, and 67% actually no longer met the PTSD criteria after 3 treatments. So essentially cured their PTSD.
3 treatments, that's how far in between treatments?
That whole protocol you can run in like 4 to 6 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's quick.
It's super quick. Super quick.
So in about a month to a month and a half, you can go from suffering from PTSD to potentially not having it anymore.
Exactly. And that, you think about PTSD, actually, interestingly, in Canada, about 8% of the Canadians are diagnosed with PTSD, which is some of the highest PTSD rates on the planet. I mean, it's hard to quantify that because a lot of other countries don't have the opportunity to even diagnose people.
I can think of a few countries that probably have a high number.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you think about that, that's the diagnosed number. How many people don't have a diagnosis, right?
Yeah.
That's a huge number. That's over 3 million people in Canada, right? In the US, there's 14 million people that suffer with PTSD. So, and so now we're in this environment where, there's clinical trials for psilocybin for depression and all of these different things that are happening. They're showing that psychedelics can be really, really useful for a whole bunch of different indications. And I think that's incredible, but psychedelics also aren't for everybody. And I think that's there's so much positivity out there around psychedelics, and this whole like microdosing wave is like bringing a lot of interest into the space and stuff like that, but these are not for everybody. They're super powerful tools, and some people are just not good for psychedelics.
Can you touch on that a little bit? Because I think people, to your point, there's that wave of microdosing coming through where people are interested in trying new things. Some of them with intention, some of them just because it's the new thing to try.
Yeah.
But when you say that it's not for everybody, walk us through why that is, what some of the fallouts of microdosing in the wrong way may come about.
Yeah, I mean, a couple, like the very, very immediate ones are like anybody who has a family history or potential of schizophrenia, bipolar. Psychedelics could actually trigger a schizophrenic event or a bipolar event, right?
Okay.
We have to really, really be careful about that. And that can be a lineage thing as well. So when we're talking about like proper diagnosing and screening and stuff like that, like you've got to look at family history. Not to be contradictory to that statement too, but there was a recent study that was done out of Vancouver, and there was a guy with really, really severe schizophrenia, and he had all these voices in his head that they had actually told him to jump off Lionsgate Bridge a couple of times in Vancouver. He tried, and they put him on a microdosing LSD protocol, and after a little while they asked him like, how are you feeling? And he said, well, I still have the voices, but they're saying really nice things to me now. And so all to say, we're at this kind of scary but interesting, but I think we just have to be super, super cautious. And a lot of people talk about this idea of like a bad trip. You hear that a lot, like, well, what if I have a bad trip? And I don't think that there's I don't think there's such thing as a bad trip. I think there's definitely such thing as a wrong set and setting, and you hear about set and setting a lot within the psychedelic space, but you see this a lot, like someone's at a party and they take, too many psilocybin mushrooms and they have this really, really challenging experience, right? And it's because you're not in an environment that is allowing you to actually move through that experience, right? But with a properly trained person and in the right environment, the more challenging experiences are actually you moving through something that is challenging within your psyche and actually trying to alleviate it or heal it, right? And so I think that's, another very, and it's funny, like walking around in Toronto, you now see all these like psychedelics dispensaries and stuff like that are popping up. And I think access is great, but we have to be super, super careful. And, also harm can happen with psychedelics too. And I think that's why a regulated environment is really, really important. There's no like everybody and their dog is now, some kind of underground psychedelic therapist, shaman, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. Right. And it's
all the more reason to be careful.
100%. Yeah. And like, according to who, there's evidence of psychedelic plants and substances being used for thousands and thousands of years in communities. But in traditional communities, that's like a 10-year process to being a person who provides those treatments. And in pretty much every community or an indigenous community where people have used psychedelic compounds, it's actually the community that says who is the person next to provide that experience. It's not some person putting up their hand being like, I'm the shaman now. I'm the local healer. Yeah. It's the community that makes that decision. And so I think all to say, there's a lot of risks that are associated with it. And we see this now even with ketamine. Ketamine is our first legal psychedelic therapy.
I wanted to ask you about that because that's the one that I'm familiar with in terms of like what I've heard people talk about.
And it's, it's interesting, up in Canada has been a little more cautious around the rollout of ketamine therapy. And we offer this in all of our clinics, and it's been really profound. Particularly around the treatment of depression. And ketamine's been used very actively in the emergency room for a very, very long time, going back to World War II and stuff.
Really?
Like yeah. So
it's actually being applied by, I'll call it traditional, maybe not traditional, but modern medicine. Yeah, it was used as an anesthetic for a long time too. So it's been used as a very long time in the emergency room. It's now starting to be applied much more to mental health care, and as I mentioned, particularly depression, but other mental health indications as well. But ketamine's also gone through, and even as a ketamine provider, ketamine is actually the only psychedelic that we have that shows a potential for abuse. Meaning that you can become addicted to ketamine as well. Whereas other psychedelics, like, nobody's necessarily getting addicted to LSD. It'd be a pretty tough thing to take on a daily basis, right?
It's like overdosing on.
So that's the other interesting thing with psychedelics as well, is there's actually no lethal dose of things like psilocybin, LSD. Ketamine you can definitely be prescribed too much. MDMA, because it has like a heart rate increase issue, if you're dehydrated and you take too much MDMA, then you can have a cardiac issue. But for pretty much all psychedelic compounds, there's no lethal dose. Like that was the thing for me that was really interesting as I started to look at this. I had all of the, LSD, puts holes in your brain and all these kinds of stuff, and we've shown that that's actually very much not the case. You'll definitely not feel very good. But there was actually a woman, recently, this was out in the news, but there was a woman who was at a party, and there was powdered LSD on a countertop, and she thought it was cocaine. And she took it like it was cocaine, and it was something like 500 doses of LSD. And she was someone who suffered with bipolar disorder. And I want to preface, like, I'm not condoning or saying that anybody
snort LSD.
Do not do that.
Yeah.
But she went through that experience and came out of it, and she had no more bipolar disorder. So, it's all to say, like, we're kind of just scratching the surface, and it's why clinical trials are so important. And again, like, you look at, and I think or MDMA is such a fascinating kind of example, and it will be it'll be the next legal psychedelic that we have, because, or why it's interesting is that the therapeutic container in the clinical trials has shown to really be why it's effective. It's not the drug. The drug is just opening up, as I was mentioning, like the default mode network. It's opening up an environment internally to be able to work with a therapist and really heal and move through some of, what might be challenging relationships with an experience that you've had in your life.
So it's not, if I understand it correctly, it's not like the drug itself is actually going from point A to point B, problem solved.
Correct.
It's sort of building an infrastructure for the person who still has to do the work with the therapist.
Absolutely.
But they're in a better state.
Correct.
To do that work.
And it makes it very tangible as well. What's really, really hard, you think about like traditional therapy, right? You go and talk to a therapist for an hour, by the time you really get into it, the session's sort of over, and then you go like, okay, well, I'll see you back here in 2 weeks, right? When do you ever get, even if you took away the drug, when do you ever get the opportunity to sit with a therapist for like 6 hours and like get into it, right? If we run clinical trials, part of what Numinus does is we're actually the site for most of the clinical trials that happen. Okay. And what's interesting right now in psychedelic clinical trials is you have like an active group, and then you have the placebo group, right? And that's kind of how you run clinical trials. We have a clinical trial with LSD right now that we're the sites for, and you either get a large dose of LSD or you get a placebo. But regardless, you have to stay in that room for 10 to 12 hours. Right?
No, just like no phones,
no phone, no nothing.
Just sit with it,
Just sit with it. And the therapist and the people who are in the placebo group, again, like 10 hours you get to spend, like no phone, no distractions, none of this kind of stuff. And through the power of intention, people are having really remarkable results just with the placebo, right? So the psychedelic drug, while it kind of gets all the limelight, it's really the therapy that makes it, really, really effective.
Can you speak on the power of intention? Just because I know, especially we're talking about the virality of microdosing. It just wants to microdose shrooms and microdose this, but people rarely talk about you have to set intentions and intentionally do it.
I think intention, like I think two things are so important when you're looking at this work is intention and reverence, right? Like the power, you think about the word placebo, right? Like people go like, oh, is microdosing a placebo? It's like, well, how much would you pay for, is the placebo working? How much would you pay for the, the placebo effect is a real thing. But I think what intention does, and we talk a lot about intention setting in the context of psychedelic therapy, and what we try and orient people around is like, don't confuse intention with expectation, right? I remember the first ayahuasca ceremony I went into, I had this like, they were like, put your intention together, right? And so I have this like list that's like, like 2 pages long of like, I'm gonna fix this, I'm not gonna have like all this kind of stuff. And I go up and they were like, what they were saying is like, hold your intention and kind of think about that as you're drinking the ayahuasca. And I go up and I'm like, oh man, I forgot. Like I had so many things on my list. I forgot what any of them were. Intention should really be like, what is your anchor? What is the thing that is, and as you're going through challenging experiences, like what is the thing that you can draw back to of like, why am I here? An intention might be like, I'm a parent. Like my intention might be like, how do I show up best for my daughter? Or how do I find more compassion for myself? Like something that is this constant like mantra or motto or whatever you want to call it of like, why am I here and why am I doing what I'm doing? And that is very, very powerful in psychedelics. And I mean, it should be, I think we go through life a lot of the time kind of just like going through the paces, going through the motion, and we forget to go like, what am I here for? What do I stand for? And that can be, I've gone through periods of like, or going through even different experiences that I've gone through with psychedelics where like really all I had was my intention. And that can get really tested too. And I think that that's important, as we go through these challenging experiences. I think that's a part of what we do is reminding ourselves why we're here. We get so confused as we grow up. You go to university, I'm supposed to get a job. I'm supposed to get Instagram followers. I'm supposed to, get YouTube likes. I'm supposed to do all of these things. And you kind of lose sight of like, am I, like, is that why I'm here? And maybe it is, and I think, not to like go on a tangent, but I think a lot of the times too, when people think about psychedelic work and that word psychedelic, there can be this fear, and I see this a lot with like men or like people who are high performers or executive types, it's like, well, I can't do that because, you know, what if I lose my edge and I'm, you know, I don't want to like wear a poncho and crystals and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, my response to that is like, that's only going to happen if that's exactly what you were supposed to do. Yeah. Right. That I think there's this opportunity with these different compounds of like us really getting back into connection of like what feels purposeful to me, what feels like, and also bigger than myself. You know, I am not my depression. I am not my chronic pain. These are things that are trying, you know, even you think about like, what is anxiety, right? Anxiety is like this experience of like being fearful of something that might happen in the future based off of like something that may have happened to me in the past, right? You know, when we talk about intention, like maybe there's an opportunity to go like, what is that thing trying to keep me safe from? We don't typically think about that. We think of it as like, oh, it's this thing that I've got to try and stop happening as quickly as possible because it's making my life challenging. Maybe that thing has been knocking at the door for a really long time, saying like, hey, there's a thing here you got to pay attention to. And if I bring my intention to that, maybe I can create a better relationship with what that thing is that's, you know, ultimately trying to keep me safe at the end of the day. Yeah.
So I still have to, like, I have so many questions. So doing ayahuasca, for example, and sort of taking the psychedelics, I can understand how it supports a person when they're dealing with a mental health issue, right? But when there's a physical element to it, how is it resolving physical pain?
You know, I think in the sense, especially like chronic pain, I think the challenge that we've had as like a Western society is we treat them in an isolated sense. And I think the thing that I was realizing is like, there's no separation, right? Other than, you know, if you break your arm, don't go to an ayahuasca ceremony. go to the hospital.
Right.
But you look at like chronic illness, right? And, you know, I think our minds, and this was at least my experience, like my mind was strong enough to fight off like what would be considered like a mental health issue. But my body was my body was the thing that was responding there. And
the body holds that trauma in different ways.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. And if you think, you know, that, and it makes a lot of sense, like when we're checking in with someone in regards to like how their mental health is, what do we say?
How you feeling?
How you feeling? It's not how are you thinking?
Right.
You know, okay. How are you feeling? Right. That's the barometer that we use for our current state.
Right.
Right. And so that, and we see this now, like we do a lot of neurology work, and actually out of Toronto, shout out to Neurology Center of Toronto. But one of the things that we see there is we treat a lot of people with epilepsy and people who have seizures. And what we started to recognize was probably almost 50% of the people who are coming to us to have seizures, when we are hooking them up to like a brain scan, when they were having a seizure, their body was having a seizure and their brain wasn't. So the body is
the one that's producing,
is the one that's having this response, right? And it makes sense. You think about your nervous system as an extension. Like, you know, I was having this conversation at dinner last night with the neurologist Evan Lewis, and we were talking about like, where does the brain end and where does the body start, right? The brain is an organ, right? If you like mechanically, like your liver would be, or like your heart would be, right? We kind of associate it with like our thoughts and all that kind of stuff because that's maybe its job, right? But it's really where we hold it's the library of where we hold our relationship to things. But the nervous system is throughout your entire body, right? And so thinking about my chronic pain, you know, I think it was as a young male, you know, who grew up, I have a younger brother who grew up in an environment where I had to take care of my mom and I had to take care of my little brother. There was no space for me to like, you know, have a mental health challenge. There was no space for me to be depressed because I wouldn't survive. Right. I had to take the role of the responsible one. And so I didn't give myself the space
It's funny you say, not funny. I mean, I'm sorry you had to go
Nah.
through that, but it's interesting you say that, because a lot of responses that we see to clips or episodes that we post around men sort of opening up to the challenges of their mental health, being vulnerable, is typically met with those types of comments, but from an angry place of, I don't have the time or the luxury to be talking about these things that you guys are talking about. I have to deal with the real world.
Yeah.
And it seems very unfortunate, because that's where a lot of men are getting stuck.
You know, and again, this is a privileged place to be able to say this, but I think the response was like, how's that working out for you?
Yeah.
You know, and I say that compassionately, you know, like, how is that working out for you? Are you showing up well as a father? Are you showing up well as a partner, as a son, as a, you know, all the things that we show up to do? And I think if you asked, if anybody is feeling that way, if you went to the people who you love, who love you, and say like, hey, I don't have time to deal with the way that I'm feeling right now because I feel responsible for this or that, you know, even if you went to the people that you feel responsible for and said that, my guess is that the majority of those people would say, take the time.
Yeah.
Right? It's hard for us, and I think especially when you have these patterns when you're young, we attach especially as men, we attach our worthiness to that, right? We attach our worthiness to like, I'm going to do this like self-sacrificing thing for the good of my group, or for the good of the people that I'm feeling responsible for, and that's my duty, right? And I'll bear that for a while, and frankly, like, thank you to that part of me that did that, because it was the thing that ultimately kept yourself safe as well. It got you through that challenging period. But more often than not, it's not serving in a long-term sense.
Comes at a heavy cost.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. And what happens once we're safe?
Yeah.
Right?
It's almost like a lot of these men are looking for
Stop
things
looking
now.
for more things to fight.
Yeah.
Right? There will be another time. Don't worry. There'll be another time where you're going to be asked to step up to the plate.
Yeah.
Right? But it doesn't need to be all the time.
Amazing. So, okay. When someone wants to, so let me backtrack here. If somebody is dealing with depression, anxiety, PTSD in some cases, how does Numinus get involved? Where do they go? How does that whole process work?
Yeah, so the way we've always, and kind of going back to my own experience, is recognition that, like, yes, psychedelics are becoming more and more available, but in our experience, what makes them effective is the preparation support, the integration support, that ongoing care is really what makes that tangible and effective for people. So we do a lot of just like traditional mental health work, talk therapy, different kind of traditional Western modalities for mental health. And we now offer MDMA assisted psychotherapy, both in Canada and the US. Up in Canada, we help change some regulations. So on a case by case basis, we can actually do psilocybin or MDMA therapy legally as well. And that's starting to open up more. Mm-hmm. So if you're a fit for that, we work with you, we do a diagnosis, and then we start to get you prepped for those different sessions. Ketamine can be everything from one session to potentially multiple sessions. And we kind of do depending on how severe your case is, there's a couple of different treatment options that we look at. And then there's ongoing care. And then, the sort of integration of those experiences.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And if someone wanted to get a hold of you to ask you more questions, is that something that you're open to?
Absolutely.
How do they reach you?
Yeah, so you can either go onto our website, numinus.com, and there's tons of resources on there. I'm pretty active out there at the moment. You can go on, all my social media stuff is just Payton Nyquvest. Continue. I'm grateful that my story, helps and inspires people. Unfortunately, there's nothing special about my story. There's a lot of people with very, very similar stories and very, very similar challenges, and the encouragement is for those people too. To, tell those stories. They're so important, and that's what inspires people when times are really, really hard. That's what inspires and brings people through. So
amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming through. I think as the space evolves, as regulations change around, what's allowable, what's legal, what's not, and stuff like that, I really think that there's going to be more conversations around this, and it becomes ever more important, to your earlier point about people taking advantage of something without really knowing what they're stepping into. These kinds of conversations become even more important because it changes, or at least it educates people. Because ultimately, if they have an educated understanding of how something can affect them, they're more inclined to do it the right way, as opposed to just going to the local pop-up shaman and deciding, you look like you know what you're talking about, hook me up type of thing.
Well, and I think just on that note, like these present the opportunities to change your life. Take it with that level of significance and seriousness. Like treat it with reverence and treat it with intention, like we talked about. Like take the bold, stance of, I'm gonna go at this like it's going to do something profound and life-changing for me, because it is the opportunity to do so. Yeah.
Incredible.
Cool.
Payton, thanks for coming through.
Thank you very much for having me.
Appreciate your time.
Appreciate
you sharing that story and sort of talking us through, educating me. I know that you know more about this stuff than I do, but like I'm just like a dumb kid trying to figure out how all this stuff works, and it's interesting because it gives me something to think about in terms of how there's more treatments out there that are not as recognized that are actually working for some people. So it's interesting to hear about the PTSD piece, how it's helped in your scenario and how it could help potentially others who might be listening and go, hey, you know what, maybe this is something I want to consider. But to your point, and this is where we'll end it, if you're going to do it with intention, and make sure you're doing it with a credible source.
Correct.
Like Numinus.
Correct. Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Pancho, thank you so much.
You,
Thanks for listening, everybody.